Shadows from the subconscious. The first thing he remembered was the screeching of tires, then the glass exploding into a rain of jagged stars. Silence followed, heavy, absolute. A blank void where pain should have been. When James woke in the hospital, his reflection stared back with hollow eyes, skin pale as paper. The accident had left him physically intact, yet something was missing. Fractured. The world felt off. Colors too dull. Sounds too sharp. And the dreams, those began almost immediately. At first, they seemed like fragments of memory. Dark corridors, shifting walls, echoes of whispered voices he couldn't quite place. But then came the figures. Shadows. Half-formed, faceless things lingering at the edges of his vision. They never touched him, but he felt their presence, oppressive and cold, like a storm pressing against the inside of his skull. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, he awoke drenched in sweat, the scent of burnt wood lingering in the air, though nothing had burned. The shadows in the dreams were growing bolder, closer. One night, he dreamt of the accident again, except this time, he wasn't the one behind the wheel. A shadow sat in the driver's seat, silent, as the car spun out of control. He woke gasping, his heart pounding, a dull ache thrumming deep behind his eyes. The unease bled into his waking life. Shapes flickered at the corners of rooms where no light should bend. Familiar objects seemed wrong. His favorite chair, slightly further from the window than he remembered. The family photos on the mantel, his mother's smile a little too stiff, his own face blurred, like it was never really his. It wasn't just paranoia. James started losing time. Hours slipped past unnoticed. Entire afternoons spent staring at walls, the minutes crumbling away like ash between his fingers. More than once, he found himself standing in rooms he didn't remember entering. The worst was the mirror. It happened late one night when sleep felt like a distant luxury. He caught his reflection watching him, just a heartbeat too long after he'd turned away. A trick of the mind. Exhaustion. Trauma. But then it blinked. That was when he called Dr. Reiner. The therapist listened patiently as James described the shadows, the time lapses, the growing sense of disconnection from reality. Reiner's voice was calm, clinical. Dissociative symptoms were common after trauma, he explained. The mind's way of shielding itself from deeper pain. Confrontation, he said. You need to face what's unresolved. James didn't tell him about the thing in the mirror. But it was getting worse. The shadows no longer lingered just at the edge of sight. Now, they whispered. Faint words he couldn't quite make out. They watched. Waiting. And deep down, James knew, whatever was coming for him wasn't just in his head. The shadows grew bolder. James woke one night with the unmistakable feeling of something standing just beyond the foot of his bed. He didn't move. Couldn't. His body felt paralyzed, a leaden weight pressing against his chest. Only his eyes shifted, scanning the darkness. For a breathless moment, he thought he saw it, something pale and jagged, just barely visible in the murk. A face, half-formed, as though carved from smoke. And then it whispered. No words. Just a soft, rasping sound like dry leaves scraping together, and suddenly James was free, gasping, heart slamming against his ribs, but alone. He tried to convince himself it was sleep paralysis. A known phenomenon. Common. Explainable. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, he found scratches on his bedroom door. Thin, deep grooves gouged into the wood as though by fingernails. His own hands ached, raw and sore. Time was unraveling. The blackouts returned, longer now. Hours where he'd find himself in unfamiliar parts of town with no memory of how he got there. Waking at odd hours, clutching objects that weren't his, an old key, a child's broken toy, a damp scrap of fabric that reeked of mildew. The dreams twisted, becoming sharper. He wasn't just reliving the accident anymore. There were other moments, other fragments. A figure, taller than him, standing in a rain-soaked alley. The scent of gasoline. The brief, horrible weight of someone else's blood on his hands. And the shadows whispered louder. "You deserve this." James refused to sleep. He barricaded the mirrors, covered the windows, and avoided darkness like it was poison. But exhaustion blurred the edges of reality, and the whispers only grew stronger when he was awake. One evening, while staring blankly into the static of his television, he felt the shift. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides, and then, there it was. Not a shadow this time. Not in his periphery. A figure. Pale. Gaunt. A mirror image of himself, but wrong. Sunken eyes like pits. Its lips twisted, curling back as though trying to smile, but forgetting how. It raised one trembling hand and pointed directly at him. And then James spoke without thinking. "What do you want?" "The thing," he answered. "You already know." The lights flickered. And James remembered. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. The accident hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. The memory unfurled like a crack spreading across ice, slow, inevitable, sharp. James had been driving that night, but not alone. There was another person in the passenger seat. A face blurred by the fog of trauma, but the emotions remained: anger, fear, guilt so overwhelming it coiled in his gut like something living. The argument had been loud, heated. Words flung like knives. And then the sudden loss of control. The tires skidding. The sound of impact. But that wasn't the whole truth, was it? Because as the fragmented images danced behind his eyes, James felt it, the cold, undeniable certainty that the shadows weren't just grief or guilt. They were parts of him. Pieces he'd buried. Regret given form, twisted into these silent figures haunting his every step. He tried to shake the thought, to rationalize it away. Trauma could fracture the mind, sure. Reiner had said as much: repression, dissociation. But this felt other. Like something older, deeper. The shadows didn't feel like metaphors. They felt real. Days passed in a fog. The blackouts persisted, longer now. Entire evenings lost. James would come to in strange places, the woods behind his house, standing knee-deep in dead leaves, with no idea how he'd gotten there. Once, he woke in his basement, clutching a torn photograph of himself as a child. His own face had been scratched out. The thing in the mirror returned. But this time, it didn't just watch. It spoke again, no sound, just a voice pressing directly into his mind, like thoughts that weren't his. "You can't keep running." James couldn't take it anymore. He dug through the wreckage of his past, both figuratively and literally. Old boxes from his attic spilled onto the floor, letters, journals, fragments of a life that felt half forgotten. And there, buried beneath the clutter, he found it, a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, detailing the accident. Only, it wasn't just an accident. It named the other victim. Lucas Greer. The name struck him like a hammer. His friend. No, his best friend. And suddenly, the shadows didn't feel like strangers anymore. They felt like witnesses. Or maybe, reminders. James stared at the clipping for a long time, the letters blurring as memories stirred like murky water. Lucas. The name echoed in his mind, dredging up fragments he'd buried, nights of reckless drinking, whispered secrets shared beneath the stars, promises that felt unbreakable. And yet, here it was, black and white: Lucas Greer, deceased. Car accident. Survivor, James Hensley. But the shadows told a different story. The nightmares returned with brutal clarity that night, more vivid than ever before. James wasn't just watching the accident anymore, he was reliving it, fully immersed in the moment. Rain hammering the windshield. The steering wheel trembling under his grip. Lucas shouting, voice distorted by panic. And then, that terrible instant when James made a choice. Not an accident. Not a slip of the wheel. He had turned a deliberate jerk to the left. Impact. The dream didn't end with the crash this time. He saw Lucas after. The broken, twisted shape slumped against the passenger door, blood soaking into his shirt. But it was his eyes James couldn't forget, wide open, glassy, and aware. Lucas had been alive, just barely. And James had stumbled out of the car, dazed, half-conscious, but awake enough to hear Lucas's final whisper. "Help, please." But he hadn't helped. He had run. James woke gasping, throat raw from screaming. The shadows were there, no longer at the edges, but surrounding his bed, looming. And they had faces now, Lucas's face, fractured, distorted, flickering between recognition and something darker. No longer just fragments of memory. They were accusing. He was accusing. Driven by a desperate need for answers, or maybe penance, James returned to the scene of the crash. The stretch of highway felt smaller than he remembered, more desolate. Rain drizzled, just enough to dampen the earth and stir the scent of wet leaves. He traced his steps carefully, each footfall weighted with dread. And then he saw it. A small wooden cross half buried in the weeds at the roadside. Weathered. Forgotten. But there. Someone had marked the place. Not out of grief, out of obligation. James knelt, trembling, the damp soil soaking into his jeans. His reflection stared back at him in a puddle at the base of the cross. But as he stared, the water rippled. And the reflection changed. Not his face anymore. Lucas. And the reflection spoke, lips moving soundlessly, eyes burning with something colder than anger. "Why did you leave me?" James stumbled back, heart racing, but the reflection didn't fade. The shadows, the whispers, the blackouts, it all made sense now. This wasn't guilt anymore. It was Lucas. And he wasn't finished with James yet. The weight of Lucas's gaze lingered even as the rippling water stilled, his reflection fading back into James's own pale, haunted face. But the voice remained, echoing in his skull like a low, relentless hum. "Why did you leave me?" No accusation. Just raw, aching loss. James staggered back from the roadside cross, his chest tight, breath shallow. The rain felt colder now, like icy needles prickling his skin. His mind spun in frantic circles, trying to rationalize the impossible. Hallucinations. Sleep deprivation. Trauma manifesting as delusions. But the truth was deeper than that. The shadows had never been random. They were fractures, fragments of the moment he buried, twisting into something darker, more tangible. Lucas wasn't haunting him from some abstract place of guilt. He was here, in the cracks James had tried so desperately to seal. The blackouts weren't lapses of memory. They were something else. Possession. No, it sounded insane. It felt insane. But how else could he explain waking up in unfamiliar places with no memory? The objects, the broken toys, the key, the torn photo, weren't random. They were Lucas's. Pieces of his life James had stolen, left behind in the wreckage while he fled. A sharp pain bloomed behind his eyes, white-hot and blinding. And then, darkness. When James woke, he wasn't at the roadside anymore. He was home. But the house felt wrong. Too quiet. The air thick with a damp, earthy scent, like rotting wood and something older, ancient. The shadows had crept further inside. They clung to the corners, elongated, reaching toward him. No. Waiting. The mirror in the hallway. The one he'd covered with a sheet weeks ago. The sheet was gone. James approached it with slow, trembling steps. His reflection stared back, gaunt, pale. But something shifted behind him in the glass. Not a reflection. Lucas. He stood there, hollow-eyed, his skin pale as frost, lips stitched tight with dark, thread-like scars that twisted across his face. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. And then, in that same voiceless whisper, "You took everything from me." James shook his head, voice cracking. "I was scared. I didn't mean." But the thing in the mirror leaned closer, so close the glass seemed to stretch, thin, as if it might crack beneath the weight of his presence. "You left me to die." The glass did crack then, splintering like frost spreading in jagged veins. And James felt it, an icy pressure pressing against his chest, his lungs seizing, his pulse faltering as the darkness closed in, dragging him deeper. Lucas wasn't just haunting him anymore. He was taking him back. The void swallowed him whole. James felt the pressure close around his chest, cold and suffocating, as if unseen hands were dragging him beneath black water. The room dissolved into a blur of shadows, shapes twisting in unnatural ways, the mirror shattering from the inside out. And then, stillness. He opened his eyes. But it wasn't his house anymore. The rain was back. Cold, relentless, tapping against glass. He was behind the wheel again. The cracked leather pressing into his palms felt all too real. Outside, the world blurred in streaks of gray. The windshield wipers dragged slow, rhythmic arcs across the glass. A sickening déjà vu, but this time, James knew. This was the moment. The radio hissed with static. The same song, the one playing that night, warbled just beneath the white noise, distorted, barely recognizable. Lucas sat beside him, not quite whole. Pale. Sunken. Eyes bloodshot but aware. His lips didn't move, but James could hear him anyway. "You can't run from this anymore." The road twisted. James felt his grip tighten on the wheel. It was all happening again. The fight. The rising tension. The words he couldn't quite remember but could feel, biting, cruel. And the decision. That violent, impulsive jerk to the left. No. Not this time. He slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed, the car fishtailing wildly, but he didn't care. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. He wasn't trapped in the past, he was inside it. Something deeper. Lucas's presence pressed against him, that unnatural cold radiating from the passenger seat. "You're not in control here." James twisted toward him, heart pounding. "You're dead, Lucas." "I didn't mean to." The windshield spiderwebbed. A crack spiraling outward, mirroring the fractures in his mind. Lucas's face distorted, splitting like broken porcelain, revealing something darker beneath the surface, something ancient, hollow, as though grief had decayed him from the inside out. "You made the choice." "No. I didn't." But even as he spoke, he remembered. The fight. Lucas's voice, raw with frustration. "Pull over. You're too drunk. You're gonna kill us both." And James, reckless, angry, refusing to listen. He'd made the choice. The crash came, sudden and violent. Glass exploding. The sickening crunch of metal folding in on itself. But this time, the dream didn't end. James lay slumped against the wheel, vision swimming. The world tilted, blurred. Lucas was still alive, gasping, barely moving, his face streaked with blood. "Help me." But James hadn't helped. He had run. Not because he was scared. Because he thought no one would know. The shadows weren't punishing him. They were waiting. Waiting for him to face it. And so he did. James reached for Lucas's hand. His skin felt wrong, like frostbitten silk, the cold biting deep. But he didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. "I should have stayed. I should have saved you." The shadows shifted. Lucas blinked. The cracks in his face softened, the darkness retreating from his eyes. For the first time, there was something else, pain, yes, but also release. The rain stopped. James woke on his living room floor, the mirror shattered, his reflection whole again. But the shadows were gone. Lucas was gone. Shadows from the subconscious. The first thing he remembered was the screeching of tires, then the glass exploding into a rain of jagged stars. Silence followed, heavy, absolute. A blank void where pain should have been. When James woke in the hospital, his reflection stared back with hollow eyes, skin pale as paper. The accident had left him physically intact, yet something was missing. Fractured. The world felt off. Colors too dull. Sounds too sharp. And the dreams, those began almost immediately. At first, they seemed like fragments of memory. Dark corridors, shifting walls, echoes of whispered voices he couldn't quite place. But then came the figures. Shadows. Half-formed, faceless things lingering at the edges of his vision. They never touched him, but he felt their presence, oppressive and cold, like a storm pressing against the inside of his skull. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, he awoke drenched in sweat, the scent of burnt wood lingering in the air, though nothing had burned. The shadows in the dreams were growing bolder, closer. One night, he dreamt of the accident again, except this time, he wasn't the one behind the wheel. A shadow sat in the driver's seat, silent, as the car spun out of control. He woke gasping, his heart pounding, a dull ache thrumming deep behind his eyes. The unease bled into his waking life. Shapes flickered at the corners of rooms where no light should bend. Familiar objects seemed wrong. His favorite chair, slightly further from the window than he remembered. The family photos on the mantel, his mother's smile a little too stiff, his own face blurred, like it was never really his. It wasn't just paranoia. James started losing time. Hours slipped past unnoticed. Entire afternoons spent staring at walls, the minutes crumbling away like ash between his fingers. More than once, he found himself standing in rooms he didn't remember entering. The worst was the mirror. It happened late one night when sleep felt like a distant luxury. He caught his reflection watching him, just a heartbeat too long after he'd turned away. A trick of the mind. Exhaustion. Trauma. But then it blinked. That was when he called Dr. Reiner. The therapist listened patiently as James described the shadows, the time lapses, the growing sense of disconnection from reality. Reiner's voice was calm, clinical. Dissociative symptoms were common after trauma, he explained. The mind's way of shielding itself from deeper pain. Confrontation, he said. You need to face what's unresolved. James didn't tell him about the thing in the mirror. But it was getting worse. The shadows no longer lingered just at the edge of sight. Now, they whispered. Faint words he couldn't quite make out. They watched. Waiting. And deep down, James knew, whatever was coming for him wasn't just in his head. The shadows grew bolder. James woke one night with the unmistakable feeling of something standing just beyond the foot of his bed. He didn't move. Couldn't. His body felt paralyzed, a leaden weight pressing against his chest. Only his eyes shifted, scanning the darkness. For a breathless moment, he thought he saw it, something pale and jagged, just barely visible in the murk. A face, half-formed, as though carved from smoke. And then it whispered. No words. Just a soft, rasping sound like dry leaves scraping together, and suddenly James was free, gasping, heart slamming against his ribs, but alone. He tried to convince himself it was sleep paralysis. A known phenomenon. Common. Explainable. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, he found scratches on his bedroom door. Thin, deep grooves gouged into the wood as though by fingernails. His own hands ached, raw and sore. Time was unraveling. The blackouts returned, longer now. Hours where he'd find himself in unfamiliar parts of town with no memory of how he got there. Waking at odd hours, clutching objects that weren't his, an old key, a child's broken toy, a damp scrap of fabric that reeked of mildew. The dreams twisted, becoming sharper. He wasn't just reliving the accident anymore. There were other moments, other fragments. A figure, taller than him, standing in a rain-soaked alley. The scent of gasoline. The brief, horrible weight of someone else's blood on his hands. And the shadows whispered louder. "You deserve this." James refused to sleep. He barricaded the mirrors, covered the windows, and avoided darkness like it was poison. But exhaustion blurred the edges of reality, and the whispers only grew stronger when he was awake. One evening, while staring blankly into the static of his television, he felt the shift. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides, and then, there it was. Not a shadow this time. Not in his periphery. A figure. Pale. Gaunt. A mirror image of himself, but wrong. Sunken eyes like pits. Its lips twisted, curling back as though trying to smile, but forgetting how. It raised one trembling hand and pointed directly at him. And then James spoke without thinking. "What do you want?" "The thing," he answered. "You already know." The lights flickered. And James remembered. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. The accident hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. And for the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful. The quiet lingered. Heavy, but not oppressive. A silence that felt more like the end of something rather than the absence of sound. James lay there, heart pounding in his chest, the dampness of sweat cooling against his skin. The broken mirror shards around him caught the dim light, their jagged edges reflecting fractured pieces of his face, but this time it was only his face. No shadows. No distorted figures lurking just beyond. But peace was a fragile thing. Days passed. At first, the weight in his chest seemed lighter. He slept, deeper than he had in months, waking without the ache of dread pressing against his ribs. The house, too, felt still, emptied of the oppressive presence he had come to fear. Yet a strange, hollow echo remained, as if something had shifted but hadn't fully left. The scars in the wood where he'd scratched his door were still there. The torn photo of his childhood face, still missing the eyes. Some marks don't fade so easily. And then came the knocking. It was soft at first. A gentle, almost polite tapping at the front door late one night when the house had fallen deathly still. James ignored it, chalking it up to the wind, but the sound persisted. Rhythmic. Deliberate. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. When he finally opened the door, there was nothing but darkness beyond the porch light's feeble glow. No wind. No footsteps leading away. Just the vast, consuming quiet of the night pressing against his chest. But as he closed the door, something felt wrong. The shadows were back. Not looming in the corners. Not whispering in his dreams. But there. Just watching. It wasn't Lucas this time. No face. No voice. Just the sensation of being seen. James knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that something had changed. The shadows hadn't left. They had only stepped back, waiting for something. Or someone. Lucas had been the beginning. But James had opened a door. And now, something else was stepping through. The knocking came again the next night. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. And this time, the shadows whispered a different name. James sat awake that night, spine rigid, the weight of the dark pressing against his chest like a suffocating hand. The knocking didn't stop. 3 measured taps. Silence. Then 3 more. The rhythm was wrong, too precise, too patient. As though whatever stood beyond his door wasn't asking to be let in. It was waiting. The shadows shifted, curling at the edges of the room, more deliberate now. No faces, no figures, just the slow, almost curious way they seemed to pulse with each knock, like a heartbeat syncing with the sound. He rose, every step toward the door feeling heavier. His pulse echoed in his ears, drowning out the silence between knocks. He didn't want to open it. Knew he shouldn't. But some primal pull, curiosity, guilt, fear, drove his hand toward the latch. The door swung inward. The porch was empty. But this time, something lay on the threshold. A small, dirt-streaked box. James hesitated, but the shadows behind him shifted again, a cold whisper quailing at his back. He picked it up. The wood felt damp, ancient, almost rotten. No lock. The lid creaked open. Inside were fragments of things he'd never seen before, but recognized anyway. A child's red marble, scuffed and cloudy with age. A single playing card, the Queen of Spades, its edges worn soft. And at the bottom, a folded scrap of yellowed paper, its surface smudged with dirt. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. 4 words. Scrawled in a messy, unfamiliar hand. You forgot the others. A chill traced his spine. Others? And then, as if the house itself breathed, the shadows stretched, spreading across the walls. Not 1. Not 2. Dozens. Shapes, half-formed but shifting. Watching. Waiting. They weren't his shadows anymore. Lucas had been the beginning. But James had opened something much, much older. And now, the house was no longer haunted. It was occupied. James stood frozen in the dim light, the box heavy in his hands, the paper's message seared into his mind. You forgot the others. The words felt heavier than guilt, pressing on him with the weight of something ancient, personal, and deeply unfinished. The shadows that stretched across the walls were no longer mere echoes of his past, they felt sentient, pressing closer, their dark forms breathing in unison, synchronized with the ache building in his chest. And then came the whisper, not a voice exactly, but something deeper, pressing into his mind from inside. You opened the door. Now, you see. The box's contents shifted. The marble seemed to pulse faintly, catching the dim light, and James felt it, faint, yet undeniable. Memories that weren't his. A child laughing in a room filled with the scent of lavender. The playing card was heavier now, almost burning in his palm as flashes of a different memory surfaced, cigarette smoke, the scrape of a chair, a man whispering a bet he shouldn't have made. These were fragments of people. Pieces of moments, stolen. No. Left behind. Forgotten by someone who thought they could walk away. The shadows weren't just tormenting him. They were here for a reckoning. Lucas had been the start. But now, the others were waking, pieces of lives James had never touched but had somehow inherited. He staggered back, the box slipping from his grasp. The marble rolled, hitting the wooden floor with a sound far too loud, echoing as if the house itself was hollow. The playing card landed face up, the Queen of Spades staring at him with a cold, mocking smile. The knocking returned. Not from the door this time. From inside. The mirror. The one he'd shattered. James turned, pulse hammering. The cracks in the glass had deepened, the fractures spreading like veins across the entire surface. But instead of his reflection, the shadows twisted there, deeper, darker, and something was moving inside. And then, from within the mirror, came a face. Not Lucas. Not anymore. A woman. Pale. Eyes black and bottomless, her mouth stitched shut with fine, thread-like scars, much like Lucas's had been. Her gaze locked onto James, unblinking, her head tilting in a slow, deliberate way, as though measuring him. And then, she moved. Her hand pressed against the glass from within, the surface warping like water around her palm. She wasn't just trapped inside the mirror. She was crossing. James backed away, heart slamming against his ribs. What do you want? His voice cracked, the words barely more than a whisper. The shadows around the mirror tore, peeling away as if something enormous stirred behind them. And then, the woman's stitched lips parted with a sickening tear, silent but visceral. Her voice was a whisper, ancient and broken, but undeniable. "You brought us here. You called us back. You took the place of the lost." James shook his head violently, the weight of her words pressing down like iron shackles. "I didn't." But even as he spoke, he knew. He hadn't just fled the accident that night. He had made a bargain. In the haze of blood and twisted metal, in the moments after Lucas had gasped his last breath, James hadn't just run. He had prayed. Not to God, but to the void, to anything listening. Begged for the chance to walk away unpunished, untouched. And something had answered. Had whispered back, offering him escape, at a price he hadn't fully understood. The shadows weren't punishing him. They were claiming what he owed. And now the debt was due. James's gaze snapped back to the mirror. The woman was halfway through now, her pale fingers pressing against the air like she was testing its weight. Behind her, more figures were stirring, half-formed, eyes hollow but aware. Faces he didn't know, but somehow felt, as if they had been tied to him by something invisible. "You will take our place." The mirror shattered outward with a deafening crack, glass exploding as the shadows surged forward, reaching for him. James stumbled back, but the house itself seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer, the darkness folding in. The figures weren't just coming through. They were pulling him in. The marble, the card, the torn paper, they had never been relics. They were anchors, pieces of the ones who had come before him. The ones who had bargained, just as he had. And now, like them, James was to become a fragment, a lingering echo bound to haunt the next soul desperate enough to seek escape. But something in him resisted. A voice, Lucas's voice. Not the twisted, broken whisper from the nightmares, but real, clear in his mind. "You can break it." James seized the playing card, its edges slicing his fingers as he raised it high. The pain was sharp, grounding him, keeping the darkness from closing fully around his mind. He forced his gaze onto the stitched woman as she loomed closer, her cold breath touching his skin. No more. The card burned. A searing, white-hot light erupting from his palm, the queen's face blackening, twisting into ash as the shadows recoiled with a piercing, soundless scream. The marble cracked, splintering in two. The woman shrieked, her form unraveling as the void behind her imploded, dragging the other shapes back with it, twisting, folding into themselves until only the shattered mirror remained. Silence. James collapsed, chest heaving, the taste of iron sharp in his mouth. The shadows were gone. The house felt still. But the weight in his chest lingered. Because he knew. He hadn't won. He had only bought time. And the next time the knocking came, he might not be strong enough to resist. The days passed slowly, dragging themselves through the haze of exhaustion and disbelief. James tried to convince himself that the worst was over, that the nightmares were nothing more than his fractured mind trying to make sense of the mess he had made. But every night, without fail, the silence would grow too thick, too suffocating, and he'd feel the shadows creeping again, just at the edges of his awareness, always watching, always waiting. The house was too quiet. Almost too empty. It felt like the air itself had thickened, drawn tighter, as though something beneath it was still alive, breathing. He tried to ignore it, tried to move on, but it was impossible. No matter how much he fought against it, the weight of what had happened never left. And with each passing night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, pulling at his thoughts, pushing him back toward the mirror, back toward the place where it all began. The knocking started again. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. It was louder this time, sharper, as though it came from inside the very walls themselves. He froze at the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't the same as before. It was different. It was closer. He didn't want to open the door. Not again. But the pressure building inside his chest was unbearable. The need to confront whatever was waiting just beyond his reach was stronger than his fear. His hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. He could feel the shadows pressing against him, the air around him thick with their presence, like 100 invisible hands grasping at him from every direction. With a sharp breath, he yanked the door open. But there was no one there. Only the same emptiness. The same cold, empty night stretching out before him. But on the ground, where the box had once been, was something new. A single, crumpled piece of paper. His name was scrawled across it in jagged, almost desperate handwriting. He bent down to pick it up, his fingers shaking. "You can never escape." The words were simple, but they hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. He had hoped, prayed, that he could outrun the darkness, that by confronting it, he would finally be free. But deep down, he had always known. It wasn't just his guilt that bound him. It wasn't just his past. It was the shadows. They were part of him now. "You will always remember." The voice echoed in his mind, not spoken aloud, but felt, reverberating through every fiber of his being. James staggered back into the house, the door slamming behind him with a resounding thud. His breath was ragged, his heart thumping in his chest like a drum. He looked around. The shadows had returned. Not just in the corners of his vision, but in full, alive, and moving, shifting across the walls, flowing like smoke, swirling around him, whispering his name. And in the center of it all, the mirror. The one that had never truly shattered. The one that had been waiting. Waiting for him to come back. Waiting for him to finally admit the truth. He approached it slowly, fear clawing at his throat, his feet heavy with dread. The reflections in the glass were wrong. They were twisted, faces he didn't recognize but felt he should, fragments of memories, pieces of lives he'd never lived, staring back at him with hollow eyes. And then, through the glass, he saw her. The woman from before. Her face was no longer stitched shut. Her eyes were wide open now, staring directly at him with a clarity that chilled him to the core. "You tried to escape," she whispered, her voice a cold wind, carrying the weight of 1,000 years. "But you cannot outrun yourself." James stepped back, his heart pounding in his ears. No, he thought. No, not again. Not this time. He had fought too hard, faced too many nightmares to go down this path again. He had to break the cycle. But the shadows were moving faster now, more aggressive, more insistent. They reached for him, their cold tendrils wrapping around his limbs, dragging him toward the mirror, pulling him closer to the darkness that waited on the other side. "You can never be free," the woman's voice echoed, a mocking tone laced with an unbearable sadness. "Not until you face the others. Not until you take their place." James struggled against the shadows, his body twisting in their grip. He fought with everything he had, every ounce of strength, but it was like fighting against the tide. The more he fought, the more they tightened their hold, pulling him closer to the mirror, to the reflection that was no longer his own. And then, he saw them. Faces in the glass. Countless faces, all staring back at him. They were his, but not his. Fragments of people, lives lived and lost, all connected by the same thread. The thread he had tried so desperately to sever. The thread that tied him to them, to the darkness, to the shadows that had been waiting. He understood now. The shadows had never been a punishment. They had always been a part of him, just as much as the guilt, the anger, the fear. They were the parts of himself he had never allowed to see the light. The parts of himself he had locked away, buried deep inside, hoping they would never resurface. But now, they were demanding to be acknowledged. And the mirror had always been the portal. The threshold between his past and his future, between the parts of himself he had lost and the parts he had yet to face. James reached out. Slowly. Cautiously. He placed his hand against the glass, and in that moment, everything shifted. The reflection in the mirror rippled, the shadows surged forward, pulling him in, and he understood. This was the end. But it wasn't the end he had hoped for. This was the reckoning. The final price. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, James knew one thing with certainty. He had never been free.